Say hello, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, April 16th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, and politics, as well as identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way, but the real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all live right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind you that our audio streams live at www.letstalknative.com. We stream live video of the show on Facebook Live. Our shows are available as podcasts on your favorite podcast platforms, and we post them on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. Excuse me. I'm the host of Let's Talk Native, and I am assisted by Jake Proud here in studio, who is managing our video and our sound. And of course, that we opened up with Crystal Shawanda by request from my wife, who said, "Why don't we hear more Crystal Shawanda?" So there we have. My roots are showing, and I hope they are. Look, I got a couple of things I want to get into. I still have to address more of the Seneca gaming issue, but before I do that, let me. I got to clear a few things up. I'm off for a little over a week, so there will be no Let's Talk Native this coming Saturday, the 20th, and next Tuesday, the 23rd. I may do some Facebook live stream on those dates just to catch up, and especially if there's something pressing or I get struck by something that I just have to get off my chest, some breaking news or whatever. So I may come to you on Tuesday and Saturday, or Saturday and Tuesday, I should say. But I will be back here on Saturday the 27th. So that's when I'll definitely be back in studio and live in studio. My New York shows, I recorded a show for this Thursday, so that show will happen. And my co-host Shawnee Rice will carry the show the following week. So those two shows will occur on Thursdays, which are it's on WBAI Thursdays from 4 to 5 p.m. Out of New York City. So those will still happen, but I am going on vacation with my family, so I'll be out for a little bit. And before I get on the specific topic, one of the things I have to put in perspective. I know how people feel about these historic buildings, but I think it's important to put some things in context. These are man-made structures. So when the Notre Dame Cathedral burns and part of it's destroyed, however it happened, carelessness through some of its renovations or whatever else, it happens. That's what happens, right? You build stuff and it lasts for so long and then it falls apart. I mean, that's why the Roman ruins are Roman ruins, and that's why the pyramids, break down after a while. I mean, it's just how it happens. Man cannot build anything that's permanent. In fact, nature doesn't build anything that's permanent. Things change with nature, and nature wears on everything. Part of what disturbs me a little bit about all the brouhaha over the Cathedral of Notre Dame burning is that people don't think twice about destroying what others might consider sacred sites because they aren't man-made. I mean, so what? And I specifically think about Mauna Kea, a mountain that the Kanaka Maoli, the Hawaiian people, hold so dear to them. It is a monument of creation because it is such an incredibly high mountain rising from sea level to an incredible height. And again, the phenomenon of being on Mauna Kea and looking into the heavens all by itself without any kind of telescope, certainly without some huge billion-dollar project, and that is this 30-meter telescope. It's magic all by itself. And so while there is almost no consideration to the desecration of what Native people, indigenous people, if you will, Native people hold sacred, we're all supposed to pine away at the fact that that buildings collapse. I mean, look, Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, most of them have been were torn down. So I mean, we can look at all these things that just happen in nature, and happen naturally to man-made structures, and of course, when you think about the destruction that war takes, the toll that it takes on historic buildings, and of course, it's real easy for people to point out what quote unquote terrorists did to loot buildings and destroy artwork and stuff like that. But you look, when you bomb cities, and when you take out such valuable infrastructure. I mean, places that are historic all by themselves. When you think about the Baghdad and the Tigris and the Euphrates and all of that. So I don't know. Look, a sheriff's boy burns a bunch of black churches in the South, and that doesn't get nearly the attention. Didn't see images posted all over. Didn't see any of that. But we're all supposed to care about an old Catholic church. And look, you can go on and on about all the historic things that took place in a church that managed to survive for 800 years. Well, it survived for 800 years, and they're going to spend $1 billion trying to renovate that damn thing, and then at the same time try to spend another $1 billion desecrating a mountain on the Big Island of Hawaii. So I don't know. I just wanted to put those things in perspective. All right. So I wrote a piece, and I haven't really submitted it to the press or as a letter or an op-ed or anything else, but I wrote a piece just the other day, and I call it, let me put it this way. And what I decided to do was to offer a different view of the Seneca gaming revenue sharing provision with the state. And rather than tear it apart directly, I want to explain what would have happened if the Senecas opened without the so-called exclusivity that the state was offering. I mean, it should be obvious, but let me go through it a little bit, because when the Senecas opened in 2002, the state promised that they would offer them something that was going to have value to them, and this something was an exclusivity. It was supposed to guarantee that within the 15 counties of Western New York, the Seneca Nation would essentially not see competition. I mean, that's what the whole idea of an exclusivity. It's to make sure that you will have a competitive advantage. So the whole idea of the Seneca Nation would build ultimately three casinos, 3 gaming facilities, and they would not see competition. Now, it's not to say that there wasn't already some gaming. I mean, the state it has been involved in gaming for quite some time, but let me put it in perspective. They had horse racing tracks, and they have a lottery, and that lottery, even got into things like quick draw or crack draw, as they call it, but quick draw, which is a little bit like Keno, I guess, that you may have seen in a casino. And this lottery, which started out being, just this idea of picking numbers, because they have all these scratch offs, it's very addicting, and you can't walk into a convenience store to buy anything without, in all likelihood, barely even in a grocery store for that matter, and not stand in line to somebody who's ordering, several dollars, $10, $20, $50 worth of scratch offs. I mean, it is essentially put this kind of gaming, this kind of gambling within hand's reach or arm's reach of anybody, because there's a convenience store every place. And so these things are distributed throughout the entire state. And so, I mean, the Seneca, New York State did have gaming, but they didn't have casinos. And so they offered that what they were offering to the Senecas was this exclusivity that they were going to give them the opportunity to have no competition for their casino gaming. Now, it's not quite that clear. I mean, really what they're offering, as you get into the details and the minutia of the exclusivity, they were really giving them exclusivity on Class 3 gaming, electronic gaming. I mean, essentially. I mean, they were actually giving them Class 3 gaming in general, but the details got into what electronic gaming would be, and they managed to weave into the deal distinction between what were considered Class 2 gaming, electronic gaming, and Class 3 electronic gaming. And there was a lot of difference between the two. I mean, at least back in the run up to 2002, those differences would become more less defined as time went on. But again, this is what New York State gave the Senecas in exchange for revenue sharing. Revenue sharing that would that was based on a percentage of the net slot drop of the slot machines that would and that percentage would increase during the 14 years of the initial term of the gaming compact. But what if they didn't have it? What would have happened if the Senecas opened in 2002 without this guarantee, without this gift that the state was giving them? What would have happened? Would there have been a casino built to compete? I mean, as the Senecas built up a market, which again, and there wasn't one. I mean, other than again scratch offs and playing the lottery and betting on horses, there wasn't gaming in the sense that from a casino standpoint, there was no casino gaming. There wasn't even high stakes bingo halls other than what was on native territory. So I mean, there was church bingos, American Legion bingos, and that kind of stuff, and so there was that kind of gaming. But so the market for this kind of gambling was didn't exist in New York State, and in fact, it was not very popular. It wasn't a very popular idea, and because of that, the state actually prohibited Class 3 gaming. They prohibited casinos, and they had prohibited for over 50 years. And part of it was because of their concern over organized crime and the connection between gambling and organized crime. And there were a lot of people who were supposedly morally against the idea of casinos. And the Senecas saw some of that that sentiment as they were acquiring land to build gaming facilities. So there had been talk, even over the last several decades, that the state would try to amend its constitution. And here's what was required for the state to do so: for the state to change their prohibition on Class 3 gaming, what had to happen is it had to pass 2 successive state legislatures. So 2 years in a row, the legislature would have to pass an amendment to the Constitution to allow Class 3 gaming. Then, after 2 successive legislatures would make this amendment, then it would have to go to public referendum. So it would take, 3 years, essentially 3 years to change the state constitution. Now, they attempted it a few times. They actually passed it through one legislature, and then they didn't pass it through the next one. So it had been attempted, and as polls were taken, it was clear that the public, especially the religious right, I mean, were opposed to the idea of legalizing gambling. I mean, that was something that the public had not warmed up to. Of course, then native gaming happens, and so in 1988, the federal government passes the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And then native people began not just doing quiet little slot parlors that they had done or high stakes bingo halls, but now went all in with this idea of Class 3 gaming, and they did well. I mean, places like Foxwood, the Pequot's gaming facilities, and Mohegan Sun, and others were really starting to have impact, and they were really established themselves in this gaming industry. Then little by little, folks in I think the Oneida put up a casino, and then Akwesasne did. I think. Actually, I'm not sure which order happened, but the Senecas did. So the Senecas would operate would probably be the biggest player in New York. They have three major gaming facilities: one in Buffalo, one in Niagara Falls, and of course one on the Allegheny territory of the Seneca Nation. And their gaming would begin to really begin to warm the public up to this idea. So the whole idea of what a public referendum would look like began to change. But I don't want to get too far away. But so I mean, this market was built by native gaming, Oneidas, Mohawks, and Senecas, and there's no question about it. There was no casino gaming market in New York State prior to that. So that's just the way it was. But again, so there was no gaming market in New York until, and especially in Western New York, until the Senecas got involved. But if they had opened up in 2002 without this exclusivity, who would have competed against them? The reality is, New York State was still in 2002. New York State was still prohibiting any Class 3 gaming. So even without a compact that says, okay, we're going to protect your market, the Senecas already had exclusivity. There was nobody else who could build a casino in Western New York. It was prohibited by state law. So what did the state give up? Is obviously a big question. Because if the Senecas had opened up in 2002, their first casino, there is no question that they wouldn't have had any competition. Well, okay, so how quickly would there have been competition? Well, the reality is, through the entire term of that initial term of the compact, that 14 years, they would have never seen competition because it was prohibited by law. In 2013, the state had finally accomplished the two successive state legislature passages, and then went to a public referendum in November, the end of 2013. After the Senecas already had a bit of a dispute, by the way, with New York State over their breach of the exclusivity, and I'll talk about what that was. Because again, by law, the state could not put up Class 3 slot machines. They couldn't have table games. They couldn't have any of the stuff that people know as a casino. By law, they couldn't do it. Not Class 3. But in 2013, they finally passed, or amended their constitution, allowing the state to begin the process of evaluating sites, taking in applications for developers who wanted to develop gaming. And when they passed this change in the constitution, it actually called for only 4 casinos to be built. 4. So there wasn't going to be some proliferation of casinos throughout New York. That wasn't going to happen. They were going to open up 4, and it was pretty already determined that there'd be one in central New York, and the other side of Rochester. There'd be one near Albany. There'd be one in the southern tier, and then one down in the Catskills area. They still wouldn't approve one for the New York City area. Closest thing they got to that was the Catskills. So that's what was passed in 2013. But having this, and that essentially gave the Senecas the exclusivity that the state was claiming to give them in the compact. So it already existed. So what could the state do with gaming? What could they do that the laws would allow? Well, what they could do is they could enhance this idea of what a Class 2 gaming electronic game would look like, and they could use existing gaming facilities like horse tracks. Now, the horse racing industry was on a dramatic decline. It still is. I mean, I know people think it's all majestic, but it's turned out to be this inhumane, this really terrible. It's hard to call it a sport, but this terrible sport, and where horses die, weekly at some of these horse tracks nationwide, not just in New York, but the New York racing industry was really crumbling. It was couldn't even stand up under its own weight. So the plan was, okay, New York State decided, well, we can trim, and we can massage the laws enough, and now there are electronic games that are still Class 2 that look and play a lot like Class 3 games. we can actually, without changing the Constitution, we can actually turn our racetracks into casinos. They just won't be Class 3 casinos. They'll be Class 2 casinos. We'll fill them with slot machines. Well, they won't be slot machines under the Class 3 definition of slot machines, but they're going to be slot machines. They're going to look like slot machines. They're going to play like slot machines. But the program will be a little bit different. They'll be banked a little bit differently. In fact, technically, they'll be considered video lottery terminals. They'll call them VLTs. They won't be slot machines in the pure sense of the word. Now, of course, one of the things that made a slot machine distinct from other electronic gaming was, at a time, you used to put coins in a slot machine, and you'd pull the handle or you press the button, then if you won, coins would spit out the bottom. And that was one of the clear distinctions of a Class 3 electronic game versus a Class 2 electronic game. But the reality is, the industry had already bailed on this whole idea of coin in, coin out slot machines anyway. It was too inconvenient. It was cumbersome. It was expensive. They'd have to keep replenishing. If they use tokens, they'd have to get tokens minted and that kind of stuff. It just didn't make sense. And the public was quite comfortable with the idea of a slot machine printing out a voucher or a receipt or a ticket that they could go redeem for cash anyway. So that's what. And that was the same for Class 2 machines and Class 3 machines. So even that distinction between a Class 2 electronic game and a Class 3 electronic game disappeared. The only difference ended up being that they were banked a little bit different. They were networked differently. On the face, they were the same box. In fact, they had the same brands. They had the same themes. Everything from like Wheel of Fortune to Blazing Sevens or whatever else. They actually began to mirror the Class 3 machines in a Class 2 design. So again, don't want to belabor the point, but what happens is the state uses their ability to get real close to the edge of Class 3 gaming with their Class 2 machines and turn racetracks throughout the state, including in the Seneca's exclusivity zone. Three facilities: the Hamburg Fairgrounds, which is a racetrack, the Batavia Downs, which I think was a harness track, and then Finger Lakes. I think that might be harness as well, but I think maybe they're all harness. I don't think they're thoroughbreds. But anyway, so those three racing tracks, horse race tracks, were a large segment of their structures were converted into slot parlors. And they called them casinos. They called it the Hamburg Casino, Batavia Casino, Finger Lakes Casino. And they began to have impact. They began to take market share from the Seneca Nation. And that's why from 2009 to 2013, the Senecas stopped paying the state. They stopped remitting the revenue sharing. They put it in escrow. And they said, look, we have a problem with what you're doing, and you're not stopping. You keep doing this. And so the debate began, and they were going to go into arbitration. I think arbitration may even have already begun by the time they actually settled it. But the debate was whether whether the state could take market share from Senecas and violate the whole idea and theme of this exclusivity simply by saying, no, but we're only doing it with Class 2 machines. And we do have, there's language in the compact that allows us to breach, it literally says this, allows us to breach the exclusivity with a different class of machine and not affect your requirement to pay us on the Class 3 machines. That literally says this in the gaming compact. But there was no question that the value of this exclusivity was chipped away at by the state finding a way to take market share away from Seneca Gaming. So that there was no question about that. But this dispute raged on, and as I said, the state passed through two successive legislatures a bill that would allow them to bring Class 3 gaming in, but they still needed to go through public referendum. This kind of put some pressure on the state. The state wanted to settle this dispute with the Senecas, and in fact, they actually worked out revenue sharing with Oneida that never did revenue sharing. They had a horse track only 3 miles down the road from their casino that had a slot parlor. But they squeezed the Oneidas, tied in land claims and everything else, and they squeezed the Oneidas to pay 25% of their net slot drop as well. The up in St. Regis, the Akwesasne Mohawk Casino, they had actually stopped paying for a crazy reason. They stopped paying because they were complaining that Gunyonge was doing gambling, and the state wasn't stopping them. So they had suspended payments too. They worked it out, and nobody touched Gunyonge, thankfully. But they released their payments to the state, and then the Senecas were the last shoe to drop. And the Senecas did work out a deal. They had been holding payments from 2009 to 2013. They had actually escrowed $600 million from in that time. $600 million were escrowed that would have gone to revenue sharing under the revenue sharing provision. And the governor wanted to settle this thing in a bad way. So the governor says, well, what will it take to settle it? And so the president of the nation suggested that they would keep $200 million of that $600 million and release $400 million and be willing to continue to pay 25%. So the Seneca settled with the state. They punished them a little bit. They forced the state to surrender $200 million of the $600 million for their breach, but then agreed that they would pay going forward. Now, part of the logic in paying going forward was twofold. One, if we settle this thing with the governor, he'll renew the compact in 2016. But the other thing is the Senecas knew that the language in the compact suggested that the payment was only going to continue through 2016. There was no provision in the compact that would pay for the renewal period. So that was kind of the logic in settling back in 2013. But again, I want to go back. What is clear is that regardless of a compact, the state could not compete against the Senecas in Class 3 anyway. And to the extent that they could compete by using, massaging the Class 2 laws and the technical development of Class 2 machines, and the fact that they had gaming sites, which were really horse tracks, they could go after some of that casino market without changing their laws. And to the extent that they could do that, they did do that. So the compact didn't protect the Senecas from any infringement of the state's desire to pursue gaming within the laws that allowed them to do it. The fact of the matter is the state couldn't put casinos up, but they could turn the racetracks into casino light. In fact, out of the settlement, when the Senecas paid the state the $400 million and kept $200 million, one of the things that the state could no longer do, at least within the so-called exclusivity zone, they could no longer call their racetracks casinos. They had to call them racinos, or just gaming sites. They couldn't refer to their electronic games as slot machines. They used to have signs lined up right down the thruway. Come play slots at Hamburg Casino. Come play slots at Batavia Casino. They had signs up. They called them slot machines. They called their gaming facilities casinos. Well, they had to change that. So they had to remove the language. And I'll tell you, it was over a year before they would take some of the thruway signs down that were still calling the Hamburg gaming facility the Hamburg Casino. But they didn't have to change anything, just the name. They were allowed to continue to grab market share from the Senecas because their laws allowed it, and now the Senecas were allowing it, even within the terms of this exclusivity provision. All right, we're gonna take a break here, and when we come back, I'll talk about what would have been different had the Senecas not had this exclusivity deal. We'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Summertime, and the living is easy. fish are jumping. And the cloud turns high. Oh, your daddy's rich. And your mama's good looking. So hush, little baby, and don't you cry. But hope this morning, now you're gonna rise up singing. And just spread your wings, and you'll take to the sky. Down till the morning, and so nothing can harm. Oh, 'cause mama and papa are standing by. Summertime, yes, and the living is so easy, yes. The fish are jumping, oh, now the cotton is high. Oh, yeah, your mama's rich, and your papa, he's so good.
All right, thanks for coming back. That's the fabulous Pura Fay and her cover of "Summertime." Look, we are doing women artists today. No diss to Murray Porter or any of the other folks that I play, but it's time to give the women some of their due. So we opened up with Crystal Shawanda, this is Pura Fay, and we'll go out with Charlie Lowry and "Dark Water Rising" when we finish. Hey, look, let me thank our sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, a few others who make contributions time to time, some here and there. One in particular that makes a regular contribution, but chooses not to advertise it, I guess. And all of you who help out by dropping a check in the mail or whatever else. And there are several of you that do that from time to time, and it certainly helps. We are entering our 10th year, and we couldn't have done it without you. And in fact, we couldn't have done it with without some of you who've helped in the past. And I'm grateful for all of it, whether you're contributing now or whether you've contributed in the past. Just the idea that Let's Talk Native, these conversations have been able to continue. And even as we've mixed it up, we went from a 1 hour show to a 2 hour show, and then to 2 1 hour shows. And of course, added onto that the opportunity to do a radio show in New York City. So couldn't do it without the support that I have, especially from RJE and from ERW. So again, I'm very, very grateful. Look, I'm also grateful to those of you who share the program, whether you share the Facebook live stream, whether you share the podcast, the YouTube videos. And of course, my wife shares the Facebook live stream on a bunch of different group pages, as do I. And the fact that you guys allow us to do that is another way that we spread the word. So I'm grateful to those of you who have group pages and like pages and different pages throughout on the Facebook platform that allow us to post our videos on your pages. So I'm grateful grateful to that as well. Oh, we're on. We also promote the show on Twitter, so I know some of you share, offer comments on Twitter, and share the links that I post there as well. So grateful to all of that. So, all right, all right. So I explained that there really wouldn't have been any difference to the Seneca Nations gaming market if they didn't get an exclusivity. Because to the extent that the state could compete against them under their own law, they did. They did it with their racetrack casinos, what they would eventually call racinos here. Um, but they couldn't build casinos, and even the prospect of doing so, there was always this debate on how much the market could bear. Like I got into a debate on television with Steve Pigeon, who said, "Oh no, Niagara Falls could support 2 or 3 casinos." Well, no, they could. Oh, look, Niagara Falls already does in a way because there's a couple on the Canadian side, but one of the things that people forget is that if the Senecas did not pay the state, and the state did somehow rush through and they did change their amend their constitution so they could do Class 3 gaming, but if they somehow could have done it earlier, which is doubtful, but if they could have, it would have been very difficult for a casino to try to be developed in any real proximity to Seneca gaming, knowing that they were going to have to compete against a gaming facility that paid nothing to the state, while they were going to pay 30, 40, 40+% of their revenue to the state. In fact, once the state did finally approve Class 3 gaming and the 4 got built, none of them have done well. None of them. And the one closest to the Seneca Nation, the one on the other side of Rochester, Del Lago, that casino can't make enough revenue to cover its debt service. They're only paying the interest. They can't even pay their debt down. And they complained, again, in a way wrongfully complained, that part of their problem was that they had to pay the state and the Senecas weren't. Well, look, if your belief was that the Senecas weren't paying the state and that they were throwing that extra revenue into promotions and marketing and free plays and that kind of stuff, you're wrong. The Senecas were setting that money aside. They weren't dumping it back into their business. Although, if they didn't have this revenue sharing in the first place, they could have. But the owners and the operators of Del Lago Casino right on the Thruway said, "Well, we can't compete if the Senecas aren't paying," which is kind of ironic, because rather than the Senecas gaining a competitive advantage by buying this exclusivity for all intents and purposes, their competition was saying, "No, we're more competitive with the Senecas when they are paying than if they weren't." So they knew that the exclusivity meant nothing, and that making sure the Senecas had to pay would reduce their profit margins was the only thing that could make, or that they believe would only thing to make them competitive. But that wasn't even the case. None of them. I mean, even the ones that are well outside of the what would you consider the gaming market from the Senecas, none of them done well. The one out near Albany, it's underperforming. None of them have even come close to their performance on what their projected revenue is going to be, including the granddaddy, the big one, the one in the Catskills that was developed, a $1 billion enterprise, from what I understand, developed by Genting Corporation, a Malaysian corporation, the ones who actually financed Foxwood at some point. And I think they even put the money up for Seneca Gaming to start off. But this was a gaming corporation. This is a corporation that was probably the most experienced gaming operator in the world. They build one in the Catskills, and they're not doing well either. They're not meeting their marks. So the belief that the Seneca Nation needed to be in have an exclusivity provision, which they already had by virtue of the state prohibition on gaming. That the belief that they needed this to be competitive kind of proves that that's simply not true. Because here's what would have happened: What would have happened if the Senecas didn't have this gaming revenue sharing provision, this exclusivity that they got from the state? They would have kept $1.5 billion, $1.4 billion they would have kept. Now, I'm not saying the Seneca Nation wouldn't have shared some of that revenue in some way with the local municipalities. It was always their intent. That's the reason they did this in the first place. The reason the Seneca Nation even entertained revenue sharing was because they wanted to, and you could, if you want to be cynical, you could say they wanted to buy political will from their local neighbors. Well, that could be true. But they also wanted to see the region benefit from their gaming enterprises. And directly. I mean, because indirectly they all benefit because the Seneca Nation isn't a foreign corporation. They aren't based in Malaysia, and they aren't based. They don't have shareholders that trade on Wall Street. The Seneca Nation spends all of their revenue back in the region, but they also would have worked out service agreements for whatever services, whatever expenses that the local municipalities incurred because of the gaming facilities, and they would have done more. In fact, they did more, even beyond the revenue sharing. The Seneca Nation paid millions of dollars into hospital charities and other things already. And the Senecas would have done that regardless of revenue sharing. But what would have changed directly, now I'm not saying it would have been the same. I mean, I think the local municipalities, and Niagara Falls being the big winner and all this stuff, out of that $1.4 billion, $400 million of it came back to Western New York, to these municipalities. And of course, there's no signs of it anywhere. You can't see what a $250 million that went to Niagara Falls, what it did to improve Niagara Falls, because it was essentially squandered under Paul Deister. But $1 billion left Western New York. It left the economy, and that has a negative impact. $1 billion left the region, never to come back. Yeah, 400 million came back, but $1 billion went to Albany and didn't come back. So $1 billion worth of hard-earned income, which was gambled away at Seneca Gaming, which would have been spent back into the area, left. It was taken out of the economy. Nobody does any kind of math on that. Nobody does any calculation on what's the negative impact of taking $1 billion out of the area over 14 years. And most of it in the last 7 or 10 years. I mean, Cuomo brags, well, I've got this new program, the Buffalo Billion. I'm gonna pour $1 billion into Western New York over some long period of time. We'll see if that ever happens. But that made big news. But nobody even talks about the $1 billion that left the area, and it left the area. Now, I'm not saying that $1 billion would have gone into Buffalo, directly into Niagara Falls and Salamanca as municipalities, that are near or adjacent to the Seneca gaming sites. And I'm not even saying that it would have been the same 400 million that would have gone, but something attractive and useful would have happened. But here's the other thing that would have happened. It would have been even more difficult for the state to carve into the market share of the Seneca gaming, even with their racinos. It would have been more difficult. And in fact, what these casinos that the state licensed casinos are seeing is that it's tough to compete against the Senecas. It's tough to grab market share. Now they're grabbing some, but not enough to meet their numbers. And in fact, these racinos, they're not even doing that well. Half of them are trying to sell themselves to the Seneca Nation, because they know they can't compete. Even their Class 2 gaming facilities. Why? Because they got to pay a lot of money to the state. They give up a pretty good chunk of their revenue to the state. So they give to the state. It takes market share away from the Senecas, and the Senecas were given to the state. So it almost cannibalized, some of the revenue what the state would have gotten had the Senecas not, scolded them to the tune of $200 million, it would have been $1.6 billion. But had they not been losing market share to these racetrack casinos and creating doubt, and of course, if the economy didn't get killed in 2008, that would have might have affected too. It would have been closer to $2 billion. So There's no question that the Seneca Nation today would have been far better off had they not been given this wonderful mystery gift from the from New York State, this exclusivity. So anybody who thinks that the only reason the Seneca Nation has been profitable is because they were given something by the state, which they paid $1.4 billion for, you're just wrong. I mean, you're just wrong. New York State couldn't have competed against them anyway. This is something that gets missed in the conversation. And, and of course, but the Senecas agreed to pay. Well, they certainly agreed to pay for 14 years. But again, what the other thing that gets missed in all this is, and I always got to get back to this, is the underlying federal law. The underlying federal law says that revenue sharing must be based on a valuable concession by the state, a concession that is substantial and one that is quantifiable. I don't know how the state could possibly say that they actually gave something up that the Senecas didn't already have because of existing state law. They can't. To the extent the state could compete against the Senecas, they did. They did it with Class 2 gaming. But they didn't prohibit gaming because of the gaming compact. They didn't prohibit the development of Class 3 gaming because they promised the Senecas an exclusivity. It was illegal to do Class 3 gaming through that entire 14 years. Oh, but yeah, the last 3, it was finally approved, but the first state licensed casino didn't come online until that 14-year period was over. And I'll tell you, if the Senecas wanted to shut down Hamburg, Racino, or Batavia Downs, or even Del Lago, they could throw their money back in their business and just be untouchable. There's no way that those guys. Now, I'm not saying the Senecas are going to give away profit just to be vindictive, although I could see the state doing that. In fact, the likelihood is the state will probably, and has already entertained, and in fact, I think they've already passed, they've reduced the amount that these racetrack casinos have to pay. And that's what these casino operators are asking to say. Well, look, I know we promised you we were going to have this much revenue, and we overestimated the market, and we thought we could steal more market share from the Indians, but we can't, and we can't pay our debt service. So can we reduce the amount we pay you? That's actually legislation that has been suggested and entered into the state legislature. So for you out there, this promise that your own state licensed casinos were going to pay for education, yeah, well, not so much. Whatever you thought, what you gave up in terms of tax abatements, and I guarantee you gave up a lot more for these gaming facilities that are state licensed than you did for any native gaming. And you know what? And I can't emphasize this point enough. Genting Corporation is a Malaysian corporation. So not only does a bunch of that revenue from the Catskills leave the area because it goes to the state, but the profits from that doesn't get spent in the Catskills. It goes back to Genting Corporation, a Malaysian. It goes back to Malaysia. It goes to their gaming corporation. And if they've got shareholders, I don't know. But even Del Lago and Rivers Casino out in Schenectady, not only does a bunch of that money leave the immediate area and kill some of the economy, because look, if you already had a vibrant restaurant industry in an area, if you already had theaters, both movie and stage and that kind of stuff, if you had all that stuff, there's only so many dollars to go around. And I've heard some of the horror stories. I've heard some of the impacts that, especially the casino in Schenectady. I heard the people complain. Well, look, our businesses are doing terrible since the casino opened because people don't have money to spend dining here if they're going to go eat and gamble at the casino. Now, I'm not saying that the Seneca Gaming didn't take away some of that clientele to other establishments. I'm sure it did. But again, the difference, every dime the Senecas got to keep out of their revenue sharing provision still got spent back in. It either went into salaries, and again, I always have to emphasize, make this point. What ultimately ended up being this 25% of the net slot drop was really more, much closer to 50% of the actual revenue from these gaming machines. Now, in case you're wondering why, the net slot drop just means the amount of money that comes into a machine minus the payout. The state got 25% of that pool of money before any other expenses came out. Now, the Senecas, out of their 75%, they had to cover everything, including all of the salaries, the casino itself, the square footage the machine occupies, the electricity, the heat, the slot techs, the cocktail waitresses and waiters. I mean, all of that stuff. The security, all of the expenses that go with the casino got covered out of the 75%. So if you took all the expenses, if you looked at a profit and loss sheet, if you went through and said, well, this is all of the costs that came out of operating a casino, if you took that out, you would find that the actual net revenue lost 25% off the top. That 25% was closer to 48%. But again, what the Senecas got to keep didn't get spent in Albany. No, most of it got spent right here. Because the Seneca people, they get a certain payout on a monthly basis for the lease for the properties that house the gaming. And the Seneca Nation has programs, and again, they have an entire government to run out of their essentially 52%, 75% of the net slot. They have the enterprise to run and an entire nation to run off of that, and all of that gets spent, and most of that gets swallowed up in salaries. I mean, some of the biggest expenses that the Seneca Nation incurs after all the salaries are the checks that go to Senecas. They get spent right in the local area: cars, restaurants, shopping, all that stuff. Education, which is local, and the medical. And these are the local doctors that work, local dentists that work at the Seneca Nation Clinic. So all of that is money spent right here in Western New York, except the Senecas entered into a deal with the state where $1 billion left. Now, going forward, what the state is trying to squeeze the Seneca Nation for now, in an ever-decreasing, if you could place any value on the so-called exclusivity, I don't know how you even call it that anymore. They took market share with their racetrack casinos. Now they built 4 casinos in the state. One of them, just outside the 15-county area. But you know what? Del Lago advertises in Western New York, TV, radio, print. There's no question that Del Lago's target audience was an existing gaming market the Senecas built. Not just from Rochester, but deep into the area that the Senecas weren't supposed to have competition. But so if you were to place a value on what the state offered, it's ironic that over the 14-year period, the percentage that the Senecas paid increased, even as the value of the exclusivity, if it had any at all, decreased. It decreased with every slot machine they put at a racetrack. It decreased with every confrontation they had with the state over breaching the exclusivity. It reduced in value every time Paul Deister shot off his mouth about not putting a fire out at the casino if one were to light. With every conflict associated with this revenue sharing provision, the exclusivity decreased in value. And the reality is, the state couldn't really control the competition that the Senecas had anyway, because of competition on the Canadian side, competition in Pennsylvania, competition in Ohio. So the value of that revenue sharing or that exclusivity provision, if it had any at all, it reduced to nothing. And now the state is involved in Class 3 gaming. So the Senecas build the market, and the state starts carving away at it, carving away, and it ultimately steps right up with Class 3 gaming. If you took the total amount of money invested in state licensed casinos, it probably stands stands even with what the money that that native people put into their gaming. I don't think they're as profitable because of what the state takes, and of course, just existing out there, it's a higher operating cost. So, what I wanted to explain with this program was that the Senecas would have been far better off never having this exclusivity that the state claims to have given them. And in fact, all of Western New York would have been $1 billion more would have remained in this economy. Because Niagara Falls can complain about what they didn't get or what they may not get going forward. But $1 billion left the area. And going forward, the state is still trying to squeeze the Senecas for another $1 billion through 2023. This recent ruling from the arbitrators has the Senecas, giving up $260 million for the first 2 years that for 2017, 2018. With what's due in this first quarter, that'll put it right close to $300 million. And the anticipation is that the Senecas are going to do everything they can to maintain their market share. And that would, if you extrapolate that out, if there's any increase in their market, they're going to hit at least $900 million, if not $1 billion, that would come out of that 25% of the net slot drop. So the state already got $1.4 billion, and they're going to try to squeeze the Senecas for another $1 billion. And again, most of that will never come back to Western New York. I think that's what people have to know. And I think it has to be clear that the Seneca Nation and Western New York as a whole would have been far better off were the state not fleecing the Senecas on this revenue sharing provision. So anyway, I wanted to lay it out that way. I wanted to explain it in a little bit different way. So perhaps it'll resonate a little bit better. Off for a couple of weeks. I might drop a message on Facebook Live, but we'll be back here live in studio on the 27th. So until then,